Hello, this is Fred Baker, one of the co-chairs of the IPv6 Operations Working Group in the IETF. Last week, Alejandro Acosta asked me a question which apparently came up in your IPv6 Doctors Forum. The question is, does the IETF continue working on IPv4, or has it limited itself to working with IPv6? The short answer, the very quick answer, is that the IETF continues to work on both protocols, but will only add features to IPv4 when the feature is also added to IPv6, and even there, it's fairly choosy about what it's willing to work on. So there's a distinct preference for IPv6, and IPv4 is treated as legacy. But we haven't stopped working on IPv4, frankly, because companies have business requirements, and sometimes that means IPv4. Now, the longer answer is a bit of a story, and humor me while I tell you that. The question of replacing IPv4 first came up in 1990. And in a solicitation in 1993 for a new protocol. We had 4 proposals of new protocols: catnip, pip from Paul Chukia, tuba, which came from Ross Callan, and of course Steve Deering and Bob Hinden's IPv6. The IETF eventually decided to follow the IPv6 track. It seemed like the one that most had legs. And so in January of 1995, the RFC 1752 came out announcing that we had collectively chosen to work on IPv6. That eventually resulted in RFC 1883, which was the original IPv6 proposal, also in December of 1995. And in December of 1998, 3 years later, the RFC that we're working on right now, which is RFC 2460. With various updates. Actually 9 different RFCs update the document, and that has just recently been obsoleted. RFC 8200 is the internet standard version of that document, which has really just come out as we speak. Now, a little bit of the history of the development. People ask, why did it take so long? Well, it took so long because you can't just deploy IP. You also need ICOMP, you need DHCP, you need, in IPv6, we needed to replace ARP with neighbor discovery, and that wound up, we invented an auto configuration protocol called Slack. And we had to get it into various routing protocols. We had to take those protocols and deploy them in labs and in network operators, various different environments, in order to observe it in operation, see that there were problems, and yes, there were problems, and then fix those problems before we were really ready to go to the races. Now, and we also, of course, needed it in hosts. We needed it in Linux. We needed it in Macintosh, Mac OS. We needed it in various other products, and especially Windows, which has a huge proportion of the market. Windows, it turns out, was the latest of those. Windows Vista came out with IPv6, and currently Microsoft is deploying Windows 10, but it was the last of the major operating systems to support IPv6. Now, once we had critical mass on the infrastructure and the capabilities, and it was clear that ISPs were able to deploy and use IPv6. ICANN in 2006 adopted a policy enabling the allocation of IPv6 address space to various providers. And in the following year, 2007, Aaron had a fairly explosive growth in the deployment of IPv6 prefixes, primarily to ISPs. We also were able to figure out when the IPv4 runout would actually happen, and it happened as predicted in 2011. And at each of the RIRs at some point since then. At this point, all of the RIRs are out of IPv4 address space, even Afrinic, which was the latest of them. And we have been watching from Google, from APNIC, from the Internet Society's IPv6 launch website, and other places, observing the growth of IPv6 traffic in the global internet to the point where some countries, such as Belgium, are generating as much IPv4 traffic going into Google, or as seen by APNIC, as seen by Akamai, that as they have seen IPv4. So it's a going concern at this point. Now, along with that, understand that the IPv4, the IETF, like any group of people, has differing opinions. It's not like the IETF has a single opinion on anything except the fact that people should run IP. And throughout that process of working on IPv6, there were people in the IETF who held off, who wanted to delay investment in it until they believed that there was a market behind it. And of course, there were others that wanted to charge forward with IPv6, and still others that believed that there was market support for both and saw a technical need for both, and therefore were quite willing to work on both protocols. That has changed over time. The preponderance of opinion in 1998 could be described as IPv4. At RIPE, I think RIPE 53, there was a song that was played by a number of the operators attending, saying, well, maybe we ought to give IPv6 a try. There was a lot of pushback. Where we are right now, there is still some pushback. There are still some people who just don't think that's happening. But increasingly, people are concluding that the inevitable will happen, and IPv6 is coming to pass. Now, in that context, in March of last year, Lee Howard submitted a document to Sunset 4, which is a working group chartered to figure out how to shut down IPv4. There's a lot more words in the charter, but that's what it comes down to. And his draft is named draft-howard-sunset4-v4 historic. The abstract for that document reads, IPv4 has been superseded by IPv6 and is therefore historic. Surprise, surprise. The IETF responded to that saying, well, that's not really true. That's not what we see in terms of deployments and so on and so forth. There's certainly important work going on with IPv6, but IPv4 is not a dead protocol by any means. And so the IETF did not immediately adopt that. A year later, however, that working group upgraded the draft to a working group draft, so it's now not just Lee's opinion, but a working group that is actively looking at the question, and that draft is draft-IETF-sunset4-IPv6-IETF. The abstract for that draft reads, the IETF will stop working on IPv4 except where needed to mitigate documented security issues, to facilitate the transition to IPv6, or to enable IPv4 decommissioning. Again, this is a draft that the IETF as a whole has not adopted, but it's one that is in active consideration and is at this point a working group draft, is something that the IETF could imaginably adopt. And when it does, then what that says is that the IETF would back off much further on IPv4 development and push much harder toward IPv6 deployment. Now, the other thing that we see going on is that operators are increasingly pushing to deploy IPv6. So for example, RFC 6540 was published by half a dozen operators who were tired of getting products from vendors that were not IPv6 capable, and said, vendor, if you're selling a product that supports IP, it needs to support IPv6. Get with the program. And at this point, I would say that the IETF's policy is very similar to that of draft IETF, Sunset 4 IPv6 IETF, in that we basically work on IPv4 under duress. We work on IPv4 when we need to, and we only add to it features that we also add to IPv6. So, no, we are working on both protocols, but we reserve work on IPv4 to that which is necessary, and ensure that the same work is also done for IPv6.